Hello and welcome to Radical Engagements here at Barnblog. And today we're talking about former guest of the show article from about 12 years ago. Left Communism, Anarchist Perspective. You can find the uh, article in the show notes. We're continuing our exploration of left communism, anarchism, and other tendencies. Don't just think I'm just going to talk about these. So we're going to go more and more in depth here. This is a kind of cursory article, and I am using it because Wayne Price has been on the show. All right. So Wayne Price compares his conception of anarchism with tendencies in left communism. We do not necessarily agree with this article, but reproduce it for reference and discussion. Okay. And we here is Juan Conant. Anarchists are often interested in minority trend and Marxism, or a set of trends, which were neither social democratic, reformist, nor Marxist-Leninist. These have been called libertarian Marxist, autonomous Marxist, ultra-left, libertarian communism, and left communist. Lenin wrote a famous pamphlet against these views, Left-wing communism and infantile disorder. I'm just going to say that autonomous Marxism didn't exist. And even though it's an Italian ultra-left current, it's actually not related to Italian left communism, and it's really a development of something else that came out of the intersection of apparismo and a workerist tendency within Marxist-Leninism and Eurocommunism in Italy. And then also later on melded with French post-Marxist and Marxist critical theory. Negri's engagement with Althusser being somewhat crucial to all this. All right. While such views go back to William Morris, the Britisher who knew both Engels and Kropotkin, the people I am writing about were active in the left of the social democratic parties before World War I. Unlike the Social Democrats, they opposed the imperialist war. I mean, unlike the Social Democrats, but like the Zimmerwald left. They were thrilled by the October 1917 Russian Revolution. They were inspired by Lenin to split from the Social Democrats, and they formed the Revolutionary Communist Parties affiliated to the Third Communist International. In the Communist International, perhaps most of the revolutionary workers who joined were politically to the left of Lenin and Trotsky. I will soon discuss this and what it means in terms of the program. This is why Lenin wrote the pamphlet Left Oppositionist existed inside the Russian Party, the Workers' Opposition, the Democratic Centralist, and Workers' Truth, etc. Yeah, back before there was a faction ban, these were the Left Oppositionists. Before the Left Opposition, from 1924 to 1929, which was the Left Opposition at that time include Trotskyists, but also Zinovievites and Kamenites and etc. So it wasn't Radek. It wasn't just Trotsky. All right. All of which were banned in 1921. Yep, they were banned under the auspices of the Civil War, and that ban was never undone. This tendency to ban factions has been thoroughgoing in communist organizing since then, and it is, in my strong opinion, always been a fundamental mistake. Remember, I always say the proletariat doesn't speak univocally. Well, if you deny factions, what that does is trying to enforce univocality on the proletariat, and it also is trying to enforce one vision upon the party and the sake of party discipline. But what it actually does is turn party infighting into a zero-sum game that increases the likelihood of mass death. So don't do it. Bad idea. All right. And all kinds of Marxists have realized that today. I think the neo-Kautsky is one of their virtues, for whatever we might think of them, is that they're pretty much Leninists, but with a opposition to a faction ban, which is smart. All right. Far left oppositionists existed elsewhere, such as the groups around Cynthia Pankhurst in Britain, But the most significant, I think, were the German Dutch left communists and the Italian left communists. See the historical studies of the International Communist Current, 1992. Yeah, the ICT, and 2001. Today's far left Marxists are still influenced by the tradition of these left communists. That's true for both that and communization theory, as we've talked a little bit about, and I'm going to talk a lot more about in my writings, because it actually has had an influence, and beyond just weird Marx sectariana in the world today. I mean, in some ways, there's tendencies in the DSA that are a weird mixture of like Althusserian influence Maoism and this sort of council communist adjacent stuff, and also autonomism. So they go in and out. All right. The German Dutch left was deeply influenced by Rosa Luxemburg, although she would not agree with all their opinions. Absolutely. Their most well-known leaders were Anton Pannekoek, Hermann Gorta, and Otto Rühle. Paul Maddock Sr. moved from Germany to the U.S., where he was active in the IWW. Karl Korsch was close to them, and most of the members of the KPD. The Leninist leadership of the German Communist Party got rid of the left wing by expelling a majority of their own party. Thank you, Paul Levy, for doing that shit. One day I'm going to have to go into the very mixed legacy of Paul Levy. I have a book by him back there. We could talk about it. He tends to be someone that I tend to think, along with Zinoviev himself, really fuck things up for people. All right. The Italian left communist, or the Italian fraction, was led at first by Amedeo Bordiga. He was a founder of the Communist Party of Italy, merging his grouping with that around Gramsci. He became the first general secretary of the CPI, supported by the majority of the membership. Under the pressure of the International, Bordiga and his co-thinkers were forced out of the party. The leadership was given instead to Gramsci and Togliatti. Under the supervision of the fascist police, Bordiga dropped out of politics for an extended period, but the groupings which followed his teachings were still called Bordigist, at least by others. I mean, they were also called Trotskyists, even though they weren't. This is the most common accusation against me, that I'm somehow a secret Trotskyite. That's a fun accusation. You always know where someone's coming from by whether or not they end it in ist and or ite. Might just call us oids at this point, but I'm not a former Trotskyite. I have studied Trotsky. I was a member of a post-Trotskyist organization, but I've never actually been a member of a Trotskyist party, and I have a lot of strong opinions about Trotsky, many of which are not good. All right. These two left communist tendencies were expelled from the Communist International. They're also to the left of Lenin and also of the Trotsky and the Trotskyists, who were expelled from the Communist International and its parties not long after. The two ultra-left tendencies had much in common politically, as I will show, yet they never merged because a major difference, namely the German-Dutch trend, wanted the capitalist state to be replaced by the rule of associated workers' councils, which led to their being called council communists, while the Italian fraction wanted it to be replaced by the dictatorship of the party, discussed below. The following is not a history of these two communist groupings, such as the organization in which they were incarnated. For that, see the ICC books, and you can tell Price is specifically pulling from the ICC, which is a council communist current, more or less, although it has influence from Bordigist in that, like, Dement was involved in its formation, even if he didn't join. Instead, I will discuss some major issues raised by the communist left, which were of interest to revolutionary anarchists, some of which at least I find interesting. See Barrow and Martin, 1974, Gouldner, 1997, Maddock, 1978, Pannekoek, 2003, Rechleff, 1976. I don't know which books he's specifically referring to here. Naturally, this would be a simplification since individuals differed in their interpretation of common ideas, and since they changed many of their minds over time, over decades of tumultuous events, and since there were splits and more rarely unifications within each tendency. Yeah, I mean, left communists don't split as much as Trotskyists do, but they split a lot. All right, there are multiple left factions. All right. The issues of left communism, the epoch of capitalist decay. Luxemburg, Lenin, and Trotsky believed that they were in the final epoch of capitalism, its epoch of decline and decay. The left communists fully agreed. Not that there could not be periods of upturn or areas of lopsided growth. Lenin believed that imperialism would cause the development of the colonialized countries and the deindustrialization of the imperialist countries, which would become parasitic upon colonialized nations. Which more or less happened, although that prediction of its geopolitical structure only really applies to World War I and World War II. They don't really apply after it, where the world looks a lot more like the ultra-imperialism of Kautsky. But it's because what Lenin argued happened, and the Soviet Union as existence unified the capitalist world in a lot of ways. But the overall direction was still downhill, with continuing stagnation, deep periodic economic crises, recurrent wars of great devastation, and political attacks on bourgeois democratic liberties. They did not know much about ecological dangers, and they didn't know. Although Bordiga did get this, one of the things where I'm going to give Bordiga some credit. Bordiga did see ecological dangers as a problem, and talked about it. In fact, one of the first pieces I ever read by Bordiga was on both ecological crisis and the problem between town and country. All right. The left communists have various Marxist theories to explain the decline. Some followed Rosa Luxemburg's concept that capitalism cannot realize a surplus value without exploiting non-capitalist countries. Others followed Lenin and Bukharin's versions of imperialism. Paul Matic was greatly influenced by the unconventional Stalinist Heinrich Grossman, who focused on the fall of rates of profits. Matic, 1981, Grossman, 1992. Grossman is interesting because he's been revitalized mostly by Trotskyists. Ted Reese and Kuhn and a few other people are Balaji. Not Balaji, Banerjee. All are majorly influenced by Grossman. But Grossman, while he was an unconventional Stalinist, he was a Frankfurt School member, and the reason why he was kicked out of the Frankfurt School for positivism seems to be that he was soft on Stalin after 1936. He was really opposed to Stalin, ironically, during the third period. And he seems to have been somewhat unconvinced by Marxist-Leninism right before he died as well. But he was not, unlike most of the Frankfurt School, particularly anti-Soviet. And in fact, he was one of the only members of the Frankfurt School who chose to go to East Germany. All right. Generally, they expected a Second World War if there was no successful revolution. Most of them did not expect an extended period of prosperity after the World War, but in 1945, Bordiga had predicted a long period of capitalist expansion and workers' reformism due to the end of the world crisis beginning in 1975, according to Guldner, page 4, which I find remarkable. I mean, Bordiga is impressive in a lot of ways, and he's also problematic in a lot of ways, which is why I devote so much time to him to the channel. All right. Some lived to see the post-World War II boom and to develop theories about it, especially Paul Matic in 1969. As much as they examined the mechanisms of capitalist decline, they emphasized that there was no automatic end to capitalism, and there was certainly no guaranteed workers' revolution, which separated them from official Soviet doctrine on that point as well. There was no essential need for class consciousness and political. There was an essential need for class consciousness and political awareness amongst the workers. Aspects of the epoch of capitalist decay included the growth of monopolies and the integration of firms with the state, which was just an extension of things that Bukharin had already seen in the beginning of the 20th century. Reorganizing this made it possible to understand the Soviet Union, not as a worker state, but as state capitalism, which they were basically correct, as opposed to the Trotskyists. The left communists developed various theories of state capitalism, as well as the nature of the Russian Revolution. For example, Bordiga worked out a somewhat particular theory in which the Soviet Union was not a state capitalist, but a form of society developing into capitalism without a current ruling class as such. And, I mean, Bordiga's kind of vindicated by the fact that 1992 happened. So, you got to give Bordiga some credit. Elections. In the First International, the main difference between Marx and the anarchists was Marx's advocacy of building working class parties to run in elections. That's what really split the International. But under certain circumstances, he maintained such parties could be legally elected into power, but in most cases, they would eventually need a revolutionary uprising. The anarchists rejected the whole electoral approach in favor of independent mass action. Lenin insisted that parties affiliated to the Communist International had to engage in elections to their parliament. It was one of the 21 points required for membership. Yep, even though, and it's that in the 21 points that actually gets Bordiga upset with it, although he accepts it as part of party discipline. Bordiga doesn't get kicked out immediately. Remember, he's not kicked out until 1926. Not that he expected this to result in a peaceful legal rose to power, but it would reserve a forum for propaganda and influence. Yep. The left communists are rejected electoralism. The Dutch, German councilists on principle, the Italians on more tactical grounds. Yes, there is a difference. Bourgeois democracy, they argued, was a fraud, a form of dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Electoralism misdirected the workers, giving them the message that even revolutionaries believed in parliament, and it led to passivity for the workers as they voted for someone to represent them and be political while they went back to work. Living as a parliamentary deputies corrupted by elected socialists, no matter how radical they start out, which is a position that I agree with, actually. It corrupted radical parties as they modified their program to reach workers at their present reformist levels of consciousness in order to get elected. Running in elections meant developing programs for managing the capitalist state, which was something Marx actually didn't want them to do, even if he wanted them to run for parliament. And that's something that is missed in a lot of people who are reformists today. That Marx actually advocated what might be called a Tea Party approach to socialist politics, which win elections, but to fuck stuff up for the capitalists, not to really build your own program, because you're going to have to seize power to do that anyway. All right. All these were lessons from the history of Marxist social democratic parties. Whatever had been the case in Marx's day, they said running in elections and serving in parliament were no longer a viable method. I mean, both the Dutch, German, and the Italians actually reject this. I think the Italians reject it on tactical grounds, but they actually have a stronger critique of democracy than the German Dutch councilists. And in fact, left communism had come around to the anarchist position. Yeah, although they disagree with anarchists on other issues, like they're still state wither-awayers. Elections. I've already read that. Unions. Here the two trends differed, and actually the Italian differs against itself on this as well. The German-Dutch left communists were opposed to working in established unions, seeing them as simply the enemy to be destroyed. Yeah, don't work with business unions, trade unions, or guild unions, which is basically all unions. They recalled how the reformist-led unions had mobilized their workers for the imperialist World War I and then sabotaged the revolution which broke out in Germany. The unions, they decided, were nothing but, and repeat, nothing but, agents of the bourgeoisie for controlling workers. The leftists either advocating forming new revolutionary unions or rejecting unions altogether, expecting workers' councils to develop in the run-up to the next revolution. The Bordigist left communists disagreed. They supported working in bureaucratic reformist-led unions and insisted that their members join them. Well, yeah, actual Bordigists do. Dementists don't, and they're part of the Italian left, and that needs to be addressed. All right. For example, quote, the communists have a duty to fight within the reformist unions that are today the sole unitary organization of the masses. But it is on the condition that they must renounce their activity, which is the safeguard of the proletarian struggle, that communists legitimize their presence in these unions. Declaration of the principles of the Belgian faction of the International Communist Left, ICC 1992, page 182. These were necessary in order to reach a large number of workers when in combat with the bourgeoisie, who still had illusions in the reformist, instead of deliberately self-isolating the revolutionary from the workers, which reformists were delighted to see happen by withdrawing from the unions. But they insisted that the revolutionaries should raise their intransigent communist program inside the unions and fight for it against the reformist leadership. On this point, I agree with the Bordigists rather than the councilists. Joining unions is not the same as running for parliament or Congress. Yeah, agreed. The latter is part of the state, while unions are working class institutions, however deformed. This is a distinction between the union as such, an organization of workers and only workers, bosses do not join, and the bureaucratic officialdom, which is an agency of the bourgeoisie within the workers' organization. However, the even worse bureaucrats must try to win something for the workers so the membership will all support them and therefore have something to sell to the capitalist class and its state. This is why U.S. unionized workers generally have higher wages than non-union workers. But when union officials are unable to win anything, then there's a real crisis, which see the 70s for why this happened. In any case, history has settled the issue. If the unions were nothing but agents of the capitalists, then capitalists would want to keep them around to serve their useful purpose of controlling the workers. But instead, when the economy is weakened, the capitalists have engaged in a bitter class war against even the best behaved business unions. In the U.S., first private sector unions were watered down from a third of the workforce to about 7%, and the public sector unions came under vicious assault. Clearly, while the capitalists might have had the best of it when they felt that they put up with the unions, now that they feel they cannot afford the unions anymore, and that on balance, unions are too much in interest of the workers rather than the bosses, naturally, liberal bureaucrats have no idea how to deal with the situation. And they still don't. All right. National liberation. The communist left focus was almost entirely on the working class and its economic fight against exploitation. They had little to say about non-class issues and oppression such as gender or race, except for war, which was impossible to ignore. They did not deal with democratic issues being focused on exposing the similarities between bourgeois democracy and formal bourgeois dictatorship. I mean, this is particularly true for the Borgias. They had no conception of seeking to win allies for the working class, except among the other oppressed sectors of the society. They did not raise non-class issues that might be directed against the state and the ruling class. A major example, although not the only one, was their opposition to national liberation, self-determination struggles. They insisted that they were inevitably bourgeois status and capitulatory to imperialism. Bordiga doesn't, and I'm going to actually point that out. Bordiga does not agree with that statement. That is a statement that is picked up by Dement on the Italian side, and all the Council Communists agree with it. But Bordiga actually does think that there's a limited purpose for national liberation struggles. They're just not communist. Also kind of my position. They insisted that there were inevitably bourgeois status and capitulatory and capitulatory to imperialism. They agreed with Luxemburg that national struggles could not win in the present epoch of imperialism and capitalist decline. Oh, I think they can win. They just get recuperated. However, this was not literally true, since at the time many nations have won political independence from their colonial overlords. There's no absolute guarantee today that Puerto Rico, Palestine, or Tibet might not yet win national independence. I mean, so far, no on those. Palestine is the most dire, but also the most likely, and the others leftists seem to be somewhat mitigated on. They tend to not support Tibet because China's, and they tend to support Puerto Rico, but have no real way to enact that. All right. However, no one can win a complete national freedom given the dominance of the great powers in the world politics and given the domination of the world market by imperial corporations, multinationals. Yep. This only strengthens the case that that libertarian socialists can make that nationalism as a program to create a capitalist national state will not work. Nationalism as a program and ideology is not the same thing as national liberation. And I can tell you, left communists are going to say that's splitting hairs. They are the same thing. I tend to be a little bit closer to Price on this. I don't think they're the same thing. I don't oppose all national liberation struggles, but I do think that they can't be presented unproblematically. Only the program of international revolution by the working class and its allies can really win full national self-determination. I mean, I would actually go further than that, but that's okay. That is the reason for revolutionaries to support national struggles and to find their ways to showing solidarity with oppressed peoples while opposing their nationalist, pro-capitalist, and statist misleaders. I would say that we often don't actually oppose their nationalist, pro-capitalist, statist misleaders. We tend to make excuses for them these days, but we used to oppose them. For the history of the anarchist involvement on national liberation and anti-imperial struggle, see Black Flame, Chapter 10, page 309 to 321. Oddly, the left communists of the Netherlands, despite their program, gave support to the Indonesian national struggle against the Dutch colonialists, and they were right to do so. I agree with that. The United Front and the Popular Front. The communist left was opposed in principle to working with other working class political trends, particularly the Social Democrats. They had betrayed the revolutions in Italy, Germany, and Russia, and were therefore, they said, nothing but agents of the capitalist class. The ultra-leftists rejected any united front with any working class parties that did not advocate communist revolution. This was ignored, the reality of millions of European workers who themselves who thought of themselves as socialists supported the social democratic parties, it should have been a question of how to reach these non-communist workers. At the same time, the left communists rejected support for bourgeois democracy, which they regarded as just as bad as fascism. They ignored the reality that bourgeois democracy permitted the existence of workers' unions, parties, the workers' press, and other organizations, such as those of the left communists. The fascists would and did destroy all of these while grounding the working class into dirt. Like the fascists, the Social Democrats opposed socialist revolution, but unlike the fascists, the Social Democrats with their parties and unions represented bourgeois democracy, required bourgeois democracy in order to exist. The existence of workers' organizations laid the basis for workers' democracy. How did this work out in practice? In the early 1920s in Italy, with the aid of big business, Mussolini organized his fascist forces. Gangs of forming armor officers, gangsters, and thugs were given fascist uniforms and sent to the cities, towns, and villages to smash up the union halls, socialist and communist party headquarters, and left-wing presses. At first, this was unopposed, but the former Reichenfall soldiers and others formed a popular militia, the Arditi del Popolo. They included workers from the whole range of the left: anarchist, anarcho-syndicalist, communist, socialist, left Republicans, those opposed to the monarchy, etc. They were effective in defending the Union headquarters in red villages, despite the fascists driving the fascists off the street and out of town. But the Socialist Party decided to sign a pact of pacification with the fascists, which was immediately broken by the fascists and withdrew its members. And at this point, the Communist Party, led by Bordiga, also withdrew its members from the Arditi, passing up the chance to pressure the Social Democrats. And for reasons, they said that they did not want their workers to follow the non-CP leadership, and that the Arditi were for democracy but not for communist revolution. No one remained but the anarchists and the syndicalists and the Republicans. They continued to fight against the fascists as best they could, but were eventually defeated. Anarchist Federation, 2006, ASAP, 1989, ICC, 1992, pages 20 to 21. So was the whole of the working class as the Italian fascists came to power and demonstrated that there was a practical difference between fascism and bourgeois democracy. This was the cause of following the left communist approach. Although we need to emphasize that the Marxist-Leninists in the same period actually adopted this position. This was the period of third periodism. Bordiga did support a united front, but from below, which became the official stance of the Soviet Union. Ironically, during the period Bordiga was kicked out from 1926 to 1936, roughly. All right. The German left communists would have repeated the same disaster with the rise of Nazism if the left had not been influential enough. They had the same approach, opposing any united front with the Social Democrats against the Nazis and insisting that Nazi rule would not be much worse than bourgeois democracy. Instead, it was the German Communist Party under the control of Stalin and his agents which carried out this ultra-left program. Yep, that was the weird thing. That's what I just mentioned. Third periodism happened. As Bordiga had before, they denounced any idea of aligning with the Social Democratic Party to fight against Nazis. They denied any distinction for the workers between parliamentary democracy and Nazi dictatorship. The German anarchists were too weak to speak for a revolutionary sanity. Leon Trotsky, then in exile from the Soviet Union, produced a series of pamphlets urging communists to call for a united front with the Social Democrats. Price 2007, Trotsky 1971. He proposed a practical military working class alliance to fight the fascists, break up their meetings, and drive them from the streets instead of letting them do this to the left. They were denounced and ignored. I am leaving aside a broader analysis of Trotsky. Once again, the left communists, if followed by others, led to disastrous consequences of the working class in the world. I don't know, man. I'm not sure that the Popular Front has actually generally worked. And the United Front works a little better. And I don't oppose United Fronts from below. But my position is actually very similar to that of Bordiga, in that I think you can work with non-political, non-communist organizations. And I might be okay with working with socialist organizations. But the other thing that it tends to include is like left republicanism and left nationalism and stuff like that. And I would exclude that. You're a socialist at best, or more, not less. So for me, like, I have an idea of Marxist and broad socialist unity, with no censorship implied for our disagreements and tactical departures. But I do not hold to making allegiances with people like the Democrats or any popular front organization. Nor am I generally okay with class collaborationism, although peasants and parts of and elements of those shut out of class relations that we normally call the lumpen, I am fine with working with if they are proletarianizing. I guess I'm also okay with that with parts of the petit bourgeois, but I'm never okay with like giving them a hand at power. All right. So that's my stance. And people who ask what I am, I tend to be somewhere in between the Trotskyist and the left communist, but not either of either. And on some things, I'm almost a downright Bakarinist. So it's hard for me to say. I also think focusing on Big Mustache Man Bad misses a lot of the points of the problems of the Soviet Union and why Stalin happened in the first place. Instead of making it all about one figure, we need to understand the logic of the situation. And I think the logic of the situation was bad, and what happened was a disaster. But I'm not sure that everything that the Trotskyists or even the left communists would have suggested would have fixed the problem. And there you go. Once the German Revolution went tits up, and once the Civil War led to a consolidation and a refusal to allow even communist workers to represent themselves honestly in their disagreements, things were pretty much set in stone. All right. And thus everything happened. So when everyone argues about, a successful revolution, I'm always like, well, 1992 happened. It puts a big damper on that. Anyway, they jumped away from their sectarian ultra-left stance. Okay, excuse me. After the victory of the Nazis in Germany, Stalinists were shocked with the results. They jumped away from their sectarian ultra-left stance right over to the United Front of Workers' Organizations. Instead, they dashed to the right to the idea of the People's Front in France, Spain, and elsewhere. The alliance of workers' organizations with liberal bourgeois parties, which guaranteed the alliance would stay within the limits of capitalism. Most of the left accepted this. Yep, this is a period of the greatest size of common turn-to-line parties. The CPUSA is the biggest in this time period. The Communist Party of France is the biggest in this time period. The Italian Party is the big in this time period. And it's the period where the results of this really pay off, where all these parties also dramatically shrink. All right, most of the left accepted this, even the mainstream of the Spanish anarchists leading the Syndicalist Union Federation and eventually joining the Spanish Popular Front government to fight Franco's fascism during the Civil War Revolution. In a way, they betrayed their program and the working class. Left communists who did not support the idea of the United Front certainly did not support these popular fronts. In this, they were correct, but the rigidity of their program and their insistence on the sectarian purity made it impossible for them to combine firmness of principles with tactical flexibility. Absolutely. This is a problem that I really have with left communists, because as someone who comes kind of out of an adjacent tradition, this inability to be flexible, this like invariance, it seems to be a death nail. In the Spanish Revolution, they insisted that both the fascist side and the Republican side, bourgeois democratic, were equally opposed and urged soldiers of both sides to desert. They did not see the value of fighting on the Republican side, but not supporting the Popular Front government, which would be the traditional United Front stance, by the way, is not support the Popular Front government, but do fight with them if they're fighting your enemies. Until the workers were strong enough to overthrow it. During World War II, they opposed the resistance in France and elsewhere the Italian partisans on the grounds that they were furthering Allied imperialism. They did not see the possibility of such forces leading to revolution as they did under Stalinist leadership also in several countries. The communist left was extremely isolated after the war and actually kind of became a non-tendency until the 1970s. Democracy, the party, and the state. The biggest difference between the Borgists and the Council Communists is over their interpretation of the goal of the dictatorship of the proletariat. What really differentiates the two left was one advocated the dictatorship of the party and the other the dictatorship of the councils, the ICC 1992, page 36. Bordiga always regarded himself as a Leninist and was accused of being more Leninist than Lenin. Unlike the Council Communist, he proudly defined himself as anti-democratic. He completely missed and dismissed the role of the Soviets and workers' councils in Russia. He actually argued against Gramsci on that. Germany and Italy, Bordiga was oblivious to the historical significance of the Soviets, workers' councils, and workers' democracy, and placed everything in the party. Goldner, 1997, pages 9, 11, and 18. Goldner admires Bordiga, although disagreeing with his anti-democratic views. It's actually pretty much where I am, too, but I think that Bordiga's anti-democratic views lead to some really odorous things if you follow them through their logical conclusion. In 1951, Bordiga summed up his views. Bordiga in 2003, the party represented the workers' class consciousness. Some Borges declared that the working class did not exist as a class without the party. It is unitary and a homogeneous party. Yeah, this is the part that I think is nuts. Its goal is to take power and to keep power. Once in power, he wrote, the party would not rely on having a statistical majority in elections. It would not rely on class democracy or workers' democracy, or advocate for a lack of having majority of votes. The Communist Party will rule alone and will never give up power without a physical struggle. Page 7. The economy would not be managed through economic democracy, but it would be organized by specialists who focus on data and their scientific study. This is why I've accused Borges of being crypto technocrats. And I stand by it. There's an article I wrote about it 10 years ago. You can go into it. In short, there would be a revolutionary and totalitarian apparatus of force and power instead of a deceitful cry of freedom. Borges may have made some contributions to theory of practice, but his overall politics are monstrous. In reality, he was an advocate of state capitalism. I don't even think he was that. I don't think it's that coherent. The German-Dutch left communists, I would actually love for Price to tell me what version of state capitalism he believes too. I'm not sure that I'm completely convinced by state capitalist theory, because I'm never sure what vector of capitalism we're looking at as the defining element of capital, which defines the Soviet Union as such. It's clear to me when you're dealing with like the capital development of China, where there's literal government-owned private corporations and shit, or semi-private corporations, like they make private profits. That didn't exist in Russia. So anyway, the German-Dutch left communists on a number of issues, but they differed on the matter of workers' democracy. It is not their original dispute with Lenin, but it became their key issue as it grew to oppose the party state in favor of rural workers' councils. Since then, history has repeatedly given examples of revolutionary situations where workers and popular councils were created by popular classes as an alternative to the bureaucratic state of capitalism. Borges and some others contrapose the goal of workers' democracy to the aim of creating a society without the law of value. For example, see Gilles Duvet, Baron and Martin, 1974. But the law of value expressed a chaotic society of commodity exchange in the market. It cannot be abolished unless freely associated producers themselves consciously organize and plan the economy. This requires fullest producer self-management, which begins as workers' democracy. However, the councilists had to deal with the relationship between the revolutionary minority, organized in a party or not, and the workers' councils. They had already rejected the idea of a party being elected to power in bourgeois parliament. They came to reject the idea of a party merely using councils to take power. So some continue to see the need, however, for a party, and others of organizations of revolutionary minority which would fight for the councils against the reformists and statist forces. Others decided there was no need for any sort of party or organization, that any such structure would lead to a party state. Otto Ruhle influenced this trend with this view. In general, council communists seem to have waffled in a confused way when dealing with this issue. Yeah, I actually do think it's a little bit all over the place. Many anarchists have similar ambiguous situations. The anarchist century I identify also rejects the idea of party as an organization which aims to take power, but believes in the need for those revolutionaries who agree on common program to organize themselves in order to spread their ideas. Platformism. That's what this is. Organizing to help coordinate their activities and to develop their ideas, where opposing trends which advocate for party states or reformism. I'm not against communist and socialist states. I'm not even 100% sure I'm against a socialist republicanism, although I think I am. What I am against is this idea that councils would be in and of themselves viable, but also that we shouldn't have parties. I'm ambivalent about how parties run an election in America, because the way to do that seems very unclear to me. All right. As an anarchist, what I like about the left communists is that it uses Marxist economic theory and other aspects of Marxist thought while advocating a program which is close to anarchism, at least a councilist. I find much of Marxist thought to be useful and see this as evidence that some of it can be integrated with anarchism. However, in many ways, left communism is deeply flawed and must be rejected. Which are those ways, Wayne? Let's talk about it. All right. In particular, left communists were right about basing revolutionary program on the epoch of capitalist decay and about analyzing the Soviet Union as state capitalist, although which form of state capitalist needs to be still strictly delimited, and people just seem to throw the word around. Strategically, they were right to oppose electoralism in favor of mass strikes and direct action. They were right to oppose the Popular Front strategy of alliance with liberal bourgeois parties. This is where I'm in agreement with the left communists. We should have never formed alliances with liberal bourgeois parties, particularly in a place like America. The Bordegists were right to advocate working inside reformist unions. The councilists were correct to emphasize the development of worker councils in revolutionary periods and to advocate for the replacement of the bourgeois state by rule of the councils. On the other hand, the left communists were rigid and ideologically blinded. They did not look for ways for the working class to build alliances. In fact, they kind of projected the whole premise and to mobilize people against all forms of oppression. The councilists were wrong to oppose the working class and reformist-led unions. All left communists were wrong to oppose giving solidarity to people in national liberation struggles. Asterisk, Bordiga didn't oppose giving people solidarity in national liberation struggles. DeMint did, and that needs to be separated, and Price just seems to not be aware of that. And to oppose united fronts. Yeah, I'm pro United Front from below. I'm iffy on United Front from above, although not totally. And I oppose Popular Front, and I also oppose sectarian idiocy as aesthetics, regardless of your sectarian orientation. Just declaring yourself something doesn't make it worthwhile, which is why Aldo Rula's position really seems confused to me. All right. Their sectarian strategy resulted in a disaster for the world's working class when it held back the fighting against Mussolini in Italy, and would have had the same effect in Germany against the Nazis. The authoritarian state capitalist politics of Bordiga, I would love to know what. I don't think Bordiga has an element of state capitalism in his blood. Wayne, sorry, I think he's authoritarian, absolutely, and dogmatic as fuck. I mean, Bordiga's parties will publish stuff like, "Yes, we are dogmatist," like proudly, but state capitalist, no, I don't think he was state capitalist at all. Although I would have to know how you define state capitalism to really argue if your assumption here is correct. Are not a version of libertarian communism. Meanwhile, the councils would have vacillated about whether to form special organizations with revolutionary minorities to fight for their program. This has greatly weakened their effectiveness. Anarchists can learn from left communists, but should not become left communist. And I feel similarly about anarchists. We should learn from anarchists, but we should not probably be anarchist. Although Marxist love of the state, as particularly loved by social democrats these days, seems to me like a fundamentally betrayal of theory and praxis. So, just so you know where I'm actually at. I do not consider myself a left communist anymore. I'm not sure that I think it is a meaningful distinction now that the common term does not exist. I do not know that there's any such thing as a left outside of capital, and positing a left outside of capitalist society posits only in an ideal nature. Right? It can only ever be ideal or aspirationally a left outside of capital. But once you view all the world as in the capitalist totality, it's hard to be outside of it, isn't it? Our critiques of the left as a whole need to be honed in because they are often vague and can be used by all kinds of different people as different forms of tailism from the normal liberal milquetoast tailism that is done. People often end up rejecting tailism, tailing right-wing things, which was what tailism was about in the first place initially, or are you going even further, suggesting things like negationism or maybe even helping fascists to get rid of the liberal threat, etc. This should all be rejected, and left communists have not historically held these positions, but individual left communists have deviated that way. Something to think about. I remember, as I said, think that we need to bury our ideological dead and learn from the best and the worst of our collective communist history. That does put me closer to the left communists and who I admire, and although I admire certain kinds and things that are Trotskyism and Maoism, all right? And I don't even hate everything the Bolsheviks did, even after Lenin was gone. It's a mixed bag. My point is we have to be honest about it. And the left communists seem to have the right principles a lot of the time, but are too rigid in them. But I understand why they are, given how unrigidness led to disaster in the beginning of the 20th century. So maybe a little bit of dogmatism is probably better than not enough. But I'm not sure about that. I can be convinced. All right. This is all. I hope you learned something from these engagements. I might have read some Maoist engagements with left communism and vice versa if they exist. Thing was with Maoists is Maoists are busy often calling each other ultra leftist. So in the Italian and Dutch German traditions tend not to actually look at the various Maoist traditions in any way, form, or fashion, particularly cogently. But we will need to talk about that on another day. All right, take care.